Imagine the world in ruins, Berlin burning under the roar of Soviet cannons. Deep underground, hidden behind concrete walls, a man awaits the end. That man is Adolf Hitler. But what few remember, what is almost never told, is that in those dark corridors, he was not alone. Around him, silent shadows guarded every movement, every word, every breath. They weren't just soldiers. They were his men of utmost confidence, the bodyguards who accompanied him at the peak of power and into the depths of defeat. Today, we are going to delve into their stories, into the faces hidden behind the Führer, in those who protected him, who served him until the end, and who later carried the weight of having been too close to the most feared figure of the 20th century. Get ready, because what you are about to hear is not just history. It is a journey to the heart of power, loyalty, and betrayal. Chapter 1. Otto Günsche, the man who saw Hitler die born. In 1917, in Jena, Otto Günsche was more than a soldier. He was the man Hitler chose as his personal adjutant, and the one who would receive the most macabre order of all, to ensure that his corpse never fell into enemy hands. From a young age, Günsche showed discipline and fanatical devotion. He joined the SS at age 17 and soon became a man of absolute trust. He fought in Poland, in France, on the Eastern Front, but his destiny was not on the battlefields, but in the shadow of the Führer. In 1943, Hitler turned him into his inseparable shadow, and 2 years later, Günsche witnessed the total decay within the Berlin bunker. On April 30th, 1945, when the silence was broken by a dry gunshot, Günsche entered the room alongside Heinz Linge. There, the bodies of Hitler and Eva Braun lay lifeless. Günsche's duty was clear: drag the bodies to the Chancellery Garden, wrap them in blankets, douse them in gasoline, and set them on fire under the roar of Soviet artillery. That day, he became the final executioner of his own leader. That day, he burned the man he had sworn to protect. Years later, he spent a decade in Soviet prisons. He returned in silence, without giving interviews, without seeking the spotlight. He died in 2003, remembered as the man who saw Hitler die and delivered him to the flames. Chapter 2. Heinz Linge, the faithful valet. If Günsche was the executing hand, Heinz Linge was the intimate witness. Born in 1913, Linge came from humble origins. He became Hitler's personal valet in 1935. His task: organizing his clothes, his routines, even his personal hygiene. He was the Führer's domestic shadow, the man who could enter his room without prior notice. Over the years, he saw Hitler transform from a charismatic leader into a sick, trembling, and paranoid old man. But he never abandoned him. On April 29, 1945, it was Linge who dressed Hitler for his symbolic wedding to Eva Braun. And the next day, it was he who heard the gunshot that sealed history. Alongside Günsche, he carried the bodies, doused them with gasoline, and burned them. Afterward, he tried to escape through the rubble of Berlin, but he was captured. He spent 10 years in Soviet prisons. When he was released, he wrote his memoirs, revealing the Führer's hidden habits. He died in 1980. Linge was the servant who accompanied him at every awakening, and in his final breath. Chapter 3. Johann Rattenhuber, the Sentinel of Power. Johann Rattenhuber, an almost forgotten man, yet a key piece. Born in 1897, he served in World War I and later in the Bavarian police. In 1933, he was appointed head of the Führerschutzkommando, the special unit responsible for protecting the Führer. He was meticulous, distant, not a fanatic, but a security professional. He inspected every train, every room, every city before Hitler set foot in them. For over a decade, Rattenhuber was the invisible guardian who ensured the dictator's life. He was in command of the bunker's security until the end. On May 1, 1945, he organized the evacuation of the Führer's last men. Shortly after, he was captured by the Soviets, sentenced to 25 years, but released in 1955. He died in 1957. Rattenhuber was not an ideologue nor a celebrated assassin. He was the silent shadow that guarded Hitler's every step until the twilight. Chapter 4. Rochus Misch, the last witness of the bunker. An orphan since childhood, Rochus Misch became Hitler's telephone operator. He was not an ideologue nor a strategist. He was the man behind the communications. His task, keeping the Führer's lines connected with his generals, his ministers, his allies. He heard everything. He spoke to everyone, but he never gave an opinion. In the bunker, his post was the underground telephone exchange. On April 30th, 1945, when the shot was heard in Hitler's private room, Misch immediately understood what had happened. The silence that followed was more devastating than any explosion. He was captured on May 2nd, sent to a Soviet gulag, and spent 9 years behind bars. He returned in 1954 and lived in West Berlin. He published his memoirs and died in 2013. He was the last survivor of the bunker, the last one to hear the fall of a regime, through the cables and the static. Chapter 5. Emil Maurice, the friend of forbidden blood. Emil Maurice was one of Hitler's first bodyguards and also one of his closest friends. He accompanied him from the initial rallies to the failed Munich Putsch in 1923. But there was a problem. Maurice had Jewish ancestry. When Himmler demanded his expulsion from the SS, Hitler intervened personally. He granted him a certificate of honorary blood, a scandalous contradiction in a regime obsessed with racial purity. Maurice was discreetly sidelined with no real power in the SS. He ended up serving as a technical officer in the Luftwaffe. After the war, he was briefly arrested but never tried as a criminal. He lived in silence until 1972. Maurice was the living paradox, the intimate friend of the Führer, protected despite having the blood that Nazism despised. Chapter 6. Julius Schreck. The first bodyguard Julius Schreck was, literally, the first. Founder of the Stoßtrupp Hitler, the embryo of the future SS. A World War I veteran, he was by Hitler's side from the very beginning. He was his driver, his escort, his trusted assistant. But his life was brief. In 1936, he died of meningitis at only 37 years old. Hitler paid him a personal tribute and ordered a special funeral. Schreck was the prototype for what would come later, the man who understood that Hitler had to be protected like a messiah. His name remained in the shadows, but his legacy was immense. Chapter 7. Ernst Röhm. The betrayed Ernst Röhm. The man who created the SA, the feared brown shirts. He was the muscle of Nazism in its beginnings, the one in charge of sowing terror in the streets. But his ambition went too far. He wanted to replace the German army with his own militia, and that Hitler could not allow. In 1934, in the famous Night of the Long Knives, Röhm was arrested. He was given the option to commit suicide. He refused. 2 SS officers executed him in his cell. It was the most brutal betrayal. The man who had protected Hitler from the start ended up falling by the hand of the same leader he helped to power. Chapter 8. Ulrich Graf. The man who took the bullets. Ulrich Graf was a Bavarian farmer and one of Hitler's first bodyguards. In the failed putsch of 1923, he stepped between Hitler and the police bullets. He took 5 shots. He survived. That act turned him into a symbol of absolute loyalty. He was the #1 bodyguard in the SS. But over time, he was relegated to a propaganda role. His health, his age, and his wounds pushed him away from true power. He died in 1950, forgotten, reduced to a memory in old party photos. Chapter 9. Bruno Gesche, the reckless bodyguard. Bruno Gesche was the head of the Begleit Kommando des Führers, the unit in charge of directly protecting Hitler during his travels. Brave, reckless, but also imprudent. His problem: alcohol. For years, Hitler protected him from Himmler's criticism. But in 1942, after threatening a comrade with a weapon, Himmler found the perfect excuse. Gesche was demoted and sent to the Eastern Front. He never returned to the Führer's inner circle. He ended the war forgotten and died in 1980 in silence. He was the example of how, even in Nazism, recklessness could cost you your downfall. Chapter 10. Reinhard Heydrich, the elegant hangman. Reinhard Heydrich was no simple bodyguard. He was the architect of terror, the man they called the man with the iron heart, the brain behind the SD, the Gestapo, and the Nazi apparatus of repression. He organized the Wannsee Conference, where the final solution was mapped out. Hitler admired him. He called him the son I always wanted to have. But in 1942, in Prague, he was attacked by the Czech resistance. He died days later. His death unleashed the massacre of the village of Lidice. He was buried as a Nazi hero, but in history, he remained as one of the most sinister men of the Third Reich. Chapter 11. Erwin Rommel, the betrayed Marshal the Desert Fox. Hitler's most brilliant general, admired even by his enemies. Rommel was loyal to the Führer until he realized the war was lost. Although he did not participate directly in the July 20 plot of 1944, his sympathies with the conspirators were evident. Hitler could not allow it. On October 14, 1944, 2 generals arrived at his house. They offered him an option: a public trial for treason and reprisals against his family, or a silent suicide with military honors. Rommel chose the second option. He died by poison, and the regime announced that he had succumbed to his war wounds. Hitler's most celebrated general ended up betrayed by the same man he had served with discipline. These men were the shadows of Hitler, some fanatics, others professionals, some loyal until death, others betrayed by the same leader they protected. But they all shared something. They were too close to absolute power, and in the end, that power consumed them. History usually remembers the dictator, but in the shadows, there were always others. The men who surrounded him, those who cared for him, those who burned him, those who betrayed him. They, too, are part of the monster. And today, their names return from the darkness.